Welcome to lecture number 8 for Introduction to Literature and the Environment. As usual, we're starting at the course website and we'll pop open to full screen. And I just wanted to draw attention to the fact that with number 8 we have moved ahead to the medieval period. We'll be looking at two texts today, The Dream of the Rood and the Canterbury Tales, which are representative, by the way, of two extremes of that period, very early medieval and then very late medieval. But also worth noting that lecture 9 will start us into the Renaissance, and then there will be a series of lectures that will show up on the second navigable lecture. But worth noting that we have up through the Renaissance covered over 4,000 years of literature, and that's just half the course. So the second half of the course is going to pick up and cover just 400 years of literature. So it'll be far more compressed time-wise, but in some ways more interesting texts because they're distinctly modern. The Renaissance is also known as the early modern period. We're going to see the birth of modern environmental concerns like industrial air pollution. But first we finish with medieval, and I should also note that going across the map this way, we are now out of northern Africa with Mesopotamian and Hebrew literature. We're out of the Mediterranean with Greek and Roman literature, and we're moving into Europe. I'll be making some reference to European literature more generally, and in fact The Dream of the Rood shows up in an Italian manuscript. But for the most part now we're going to be in England, and England and North America are going to be our preoccupations for the rest of the term. And the reason for that, of course, this is an English course doing English and American literature, and we are English-speaking people here. At least that's the way the course is set up. So let's jump right into number 8. And number 8 is The Dream of the Rood and Chaucer's The Nuns' Priest's Tale. So we'll start with The Dream of the Rood first. It's good to start with it first insofar as this text is old. This is you're seeing here is the Ruthwell Cross, which is in northeast England, and the Dream of the Rood is actually inscribed in this stone cross, at least a form of the Dream of the Rood, in 8th century. So we're here at the very beginning of English literature. To put a time frame on it, you're not too far off from Beowulf, which is, especially in surveys of English literature and medieval literature, we think of that as one of the earliest English texts. So this is right around there too. Although, worth noting here that this appears roughly 800 years after Virgil then, and Virgil in turn came 700 years after Hesiod, and 1500 years or so before Hesiod was in fact Gilgamesh. So to put it in time frame though, the earliest Greek texts that we have are almost as far away from the Roman texts that we deal with, which are about the same distance away from the early text that we're going to be dealing with today that's distinctly medieval. And that in turn is about that far away from Renaissance. So we're making big leaps, in this case from the early Greek to the Roman to the medieval to the Renaissance, about 700 or 800 years in each jump. This is actually written in Old English. So the Ruthwell Cross begins, Christus on the Rood, hefre perfusum farum quanum appelle to anum. Christ was on the cross, yet the brave came there from afar to their Lord. So yes, this is the beginning of English literature, but doesn't look very much like English in some respects. In many ways it looks more like High German, and there are certainly strong family resemblances there for that reason. You can see some things will come to be pretty directly into English. Christ, obviously. We're talking about the Rood here. Same word in English, although in a minute we'll talk about the fact that it's an unusual word in modern English. But this language has to undergo a lot of changes before it becomes sort of recognizable to us. We're going to see that directly with Chaucer, because Chaucer is writing in Middle English, and a form of Middle English that was especially common in London, that gave birth to modern English. So Chaucer, we actually read in Middle English because he's still recognizable, but the Ruthwell Cross, and this also gives you some inkling of the age of it. It comes from a time when English was very different than it is now. The version that we read, which is in the reader, comes from this 10th century text, the Vercelli book, which is actually an Italian book where it was written down. So important to think of also, going back to Gilgamesh, and we talked about this in reference to Homer as well, that this is a text that predates texts in a way. Beowulf is like that too. It's this English epic that is spoken before it is ever written down. The dream of the Rood presumably was told repeatedly in an oral tradition in a number of different forms. It gets recorded in the Ruthwell Cross. It gets fleshed out here in more detail as something resembling literature in the Vercelli book. But again, it's so old, it's coming from this oral tradition. Yeah, you could call it road, but the rood is usually the way we would pronounce it. It's just a pole or a cross. It does continue for hundreds of years in use, so you may, if you know your Hamlet well enough, Hamlet says, "No, by the rood, not so," not so by the cross. But just to, for our purposes, it's important to note that the rood is the cross. So this is the dream of the cross. That's what this story is. The dream is something worth talking about here. First off, this is a dream of a religious mystic. This is not like a daydream or a night dream. This is a vision that a religious mystic has. That is the dreamer here. And he has a dream in which the cross that Christ died upon is talking to him. So if you look it over, reread it, you'll see that the dreamer starts talking about this story that he had related to him by the cross, and this doesn't happen literally in any setting, but it's during this religious dream, this vision that he has. And the tree is telling this dreamer how it became the sacred cross that Christ died upon. So it's a little confusing at times in the version that we have, but you actually have two speakers, and it switches. One is the dreamer telling about the dream that he has, but then switching, and by the way, I said he, and I think that's accurate that it is a male voice here, switching over then, telling the story of what the cross said to him. So it's a little confusing, but you'll see where it's there is a difference in the text. It is interesting that we have an anthropomorphized and sentient tree. This is something we haven't seen before. It's not only that this is like an animal that can speak, or that we ascribe sentience to the animal, which we know Varro did to his pigeons, but this is a tree that feels and thinks. But it's important to realize that the ancient Celts inhabiting England worshipped, in addition to the earth and larger deities, the sea, the sky, and all that, but also particular features of the environment, streams, lakes, hills, and especially trees and oak trees. This is largely in the form of genus loci figures. So a genus loci of a stream or a hill would be an entity that could talk. Not unlike what we have in Gilgamesh, where we have the protector of trees, Humbaba, is actually speaking. Although here it is seen in a much more literal way, that the tree itself is able to speak, which is interesting here, and it's especially interesting that it is a tree. You may know the word Druid. These are the Celtic priests. They were actually given that name. It's not their indigenous name or name for themselves, but by Caesar, during one of his campaigns because he noticed that they worshipped trees. So in Latin, Druid simply means sorcerer, and these people were seen as sort of magicians. It does derive from the Greek dros, which means oak tree. So hence Druid literally means the people who worshipped oak trees. This is the defining characteristic that Caesar will see with these people. And it was sort of surprising, I suppose, when the Romans encountered them. Early Christians, and this would be during the period that we're seeing here, and it continues today, the use of the word pagan. Pagan derives from the Latin word pagus and pangere, which literally means to stick something into the ground, to firmly plant it there. So to those early Christians today even, who believe that their souls are able to transcend the earth, pagans are people literally rooted into the ground, stuck in the ground, can't move from the ground. And the very name suggests that metaphysical-physical divide that we noted earlier in the course, that, human beings in a metaphysical framework are part of the ground and part of the metaphysical world. And that makes us this sort of strangely straddling the two realms. But according to Christians, what makes pagans different, they're not like that. They are rooted in the earth. They are of the earth. They can't transcend it. And that's not inaccurate in the sense that that's how these earth religions saw themselves as well. They didn't see anything necessarily beyond the earth. They were just part of the earth. They were people of the earth, and in some cases they actually referred to themselves as people of the earth, people of the forest, or whatever. So Christianity wanted to make that distinction clear. So when you think about it, whenever you hear the word pagan being used, this has a certain environmental import, right? This is saying earth people of the earth who are not by nature transcendent or given that ability. So in the Dream of the Rood, it's fascinating because you have Christianity, early Christian thinking, and pagan worlds colliding together. We have two deities superimposed on each other. One, soon to be metaphysical deity, this is Jesus. So, when Jesus is on the earth, the human being, he's Jesus, but he's soon to be resurrected, brought up into heaven, become the Christ, this, the savior of all human beings, but a metaphysical deity. And you have here also a deity of, the Druid people, an earth tree that would have been worshipped as a feature of the environment. So these two are superimposed on each other, and they're superimposed visually as well. So if you imagine the cross, spread out on either side, coming up, Jesus fits on the cross perfectly because it's designed that way. His arms are tied onto either side of the cross member, and then his legs are tied to the vertical member. So it's this perfect sort of superimposition of one or the other. They both take the same form. They're both existing together. You look at them, you both see them in the same shape. And, ever here and ever after, the cross becomes a symbol for Christ because that is his shape at the time of the crucifixion. So we talked about this, and we saw the beginning of it early in the course. So we saw a newer kind of religion, which is sort of intimating the metaphysical religion, and that's in the myth of Gilgamesh encountering an older earth religion, a collision of the two, which literally played out as a battle between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, destroying the old religion by destroying a genus Loki, Humbaba, that defended it. That had always gone on, those sort of religious conflicts, but in Christianity this will happen repeatedly now. So we're in the medieval period. Christianity has risen out of the Holy Roman Empire. Now it is the new Roman Catholic Church. This religion will now spread out of what was the Mediterranean, all through the world. So it has spread now from Rome, and by the 8th century and well before, it had moved through Europe and was now in England. So now we have this religion encountering this older religion, these earth religions, which is going to do repeatedly all through Europe, Asia, Africa, the Americas. Everywhere it goes, it encounters different religions, and you're seeing here the collision of those. And it is a transitional text, or it suggests a transitional posture for Christianity. So it's a transitional text in the sense that it transitions pagans, people of the earth, into Christians. And it's able to do so by doubling. We've seen doublings before in this course. There's a doubling with Gilgamesh and Enkidu and Gilgamesh and Humbaba. Here it's between the Rood and Jesus. What happens now is the Rood takes on some of Jesus's qualities and Jesus some of the Rood's qualities. Why would you do this? Well, if you're introducing a new religion, a new deity, you want that deity to have characteristics that are understandable to the people that you would like to convert to your religion. So your deity seems a lot like their deity, they're more likely to accept it. If you then can argue your deity is like theirs but has even better qualities, which is the argument made here, then it's easier to transition these people into Christians. It is surprising, however. Look at the description of Jesus. He's described as a young hero, a warrior, a mighty king, strong with a stout heart. He's active, right? He climbs the cross. He strips himself. He is characterized as a warrior. This is a warrior culture. This is the way they characterize him. It's fascinating because this is very different than Christianity, the Christian normal portrayal of Jesus, the way that it would be done today, or even the way that it was done at this time. Jesus is not described as a hero in the sense of being understandable to a civilization that liked heroes. He's not a warrior. If anything, he defeats not with strength, but with sort of, weakness, his humility, the suffering on the cross. Martin Luther will call that, the humility of the cross, the suffering on the cross, the core of Christianity. That's not here, though. This is not a religion about humiliation and the strengthless strength of non-strength. This is about a warrior culture. So again, if you're trying to sell your religion to a warrior culture, to people who like things like strength and heroes and warriors, probably not the best thing to do to say that your greatest deity is a non-warrior, non-hero. It's an abject person that allows things to happen to him. No, you want to describe him as active. He climbs the cross. He's not stripped. He strips himself. And the tree is described as still, again to the religion of these people, as a powerful deity of place. The tree says, just like Jesus, I might have felled all foes, but I stood fast. Great language, by the way. Felled all foes, cut them down the way he had been cut down himself. But instead of being doing what he could do as a powerful genus loci, Humbaba was powerful too. It took a lot to beat him. That he follows Jesus's lead. I didn't harm any of them, even while being crucified. So like Jesus is an incredibly powerful deity, but allows himself to die for the sake of another. In this case, Jesus, just as Jesus died for the faithful. You can see already a transitioning happening here, right? So this powerful deity is not acting the way a warrior would act, but is acting in this new way. So he's taking on characteristics that are distinctly not pagan at all, that are sort of central, though, to Christianity. The doubling is very complete. The tree says, they pierced me with dark nails, the wounds are seen on me, open gashes of hate. I was all drenched with blood. Of course, this is Jesus's blood. But again, this sentence could just as well have been said by Jesus. They pierced me, Jesus, with dark nails. The wounds are seen on me, Jesus, open gashes of hate. But again, it's to connect up these two deities. So the same exact thing is happening to both of them, inflicted by the same people. And those antagonists are the common enemies of both, those strong foes who seized the root there, hewn me to the shape they wished to see, as well as crucified Jesus. This is clever in the sense that it aligns these two religions. There's a common enemy, and it's not the case. It is the case that it's common to both the Rood and to Jesus. When you think about this, you stand back and look at everything we just said. You're superimposing one deity, Jesus, on another deity. You look up at the cross, they're both there together, they're both suffering the same. And in a way, what you're doing is bringing the followers of one religion to this new deity that is there. Deity, as a consequence, has to be described, or most effectively will be described like the old deities, so that it gets you to buy into the idea, and you see these two together. And in that sense, it's sort of aligning them and saying, well, one is as good as the other. But Christianity has a little trick coming. Well, first off, hold on, just let me go back to that. Sorry. It's worth noting, and what will happen throughout the history of Christianity and sort of evangelical mission to bring people in, is once the pagans are brought into Christianity through making this motion, that even though conspicuous features of the earlier earth-centered religions will be brought in with them, they will ultimately fall away. So the cross will still obviously be important in Christianity. It's an important imagery, but as far as its connection to the earth and all, not always kept. Certainly not kept in the way that the Druids would have imagined that connection to the earth. It is interesting that it incorporates into this story, which is pretty striking, the destruction of the earth religions. The tree's defining bond, what the tree is connected to the earth. That's it. We saw this with Humbaba, who is like one of the cedar trees. Humbaba, when he's symbolically cut down, which is what Gilgamesh does, he symbolically cuts the tree, he cuts down the genus Loki. Once that is done, the deity is done. That is when Gilgamesh, that's when Humbaba, that's when he was defeated, that's when he ended. But here it's covered, that moment is when it ends, when its connection to the earth is ended, then it's brought into this new order, which is, it's brought in as the cross. It has a new life here. But it's just fascinating that, it would be like cutting down Humbaba and at that moment fashioning him into a cross. And that's where his story begins, that when the moment he becomes a cross. Christianity has this fascinating innovation now, and that's where the Rood as a deity now completely will fall away. So the connection to the earth has been severed. He is now, cut down. He is going to die. But what's amazing is that, in this new religion, Christ is able to be reborn metaphysically. He is able to be born again, and furthermore, he offers that possibility of being born again to all the faithful. So human beings do not have to die. You're outside of the, we saw with Andy Goldsworthy, these endless cycles of nature, of birth, growth, and passing away. That's what defined nature for the ancient Greeks, and arguably that sort of thing defines nature for the Druids and many earth-centered religions. But no, here's a way of stepping outside of that and becoming metaphysical the way Jesus becomes metaphysical. And of course, that means the Christianity severely, in a big way, trumps the older religions, because it offers something that they can never do. The bond to the earth then is seen as more than anything else as sort of a detriment, insofar as, again, you're trapped into the endless cycle of birth, growth, and passing away. The new commitment, the new bond to the metaphysical realm gets you out of all that. It takes you into something else again. That's the triumph of metaphysical religion. Yeah, a disclaimer. I don't mean to say that Christianity has to be at odds with earth-centered religions. It has to eradicate them. Historically, it is the case that that will happen. You'll see it all over the place, Africa, South America, Asia, where Christianity did encounter older religions. It did systematically try to convert people to Christianity, away from the physical toward metaphysical gods. But it is a hermeneutic question of how you interpret Christianity. Can it be earth-friendly? Was that a good project? I mean, is it inherent in the way Christianity works, or is it just the way that Christianity historically has worked? These are all hermeneutic questions. So, leaving the dream of the Rood, I want to move to the Canterbury Tales. This is a 14th century work. This would be very late 14th century, and with that it's very late medieval text as well. So again, we've just gone from the Ruthwell Cross in the 8th century to the 14th century. This is a huge period of time. This is 600 years. This is right before the advent of the printing press. This is a manuscript page, the way that Chaucer would have appeared before the printing press came on the scene. Chaucer, I should add, was very popular even at the time. So when the printing press is introduced in the 15th century into England, the first book that is published, printed, is, perhaps not surprisingly, the Bible. The second book that is printed is the Canterbury Tale. So enormously important text, just predating the advent of the printing press, and yet its popularity in part stems from the spread of printed text. He is writing 600 years after the Ruthwell Cross. And something to note here, while we are still technically in the Middle Ages, the Renaissance in England, the medieval period in England, already in Europe and other places, especially in Italy, we have entered the Renaissance. So Chaucer is technically a medieval writer because he's writing in England in the late 14th century. Had he been writing elsewhere, such as Rome, he would be a Renaissance writer. And in fairness to Chaucer, Chaucer was well aware of what was happening on the continent. He is opening the way for the Renaissance in England. I think that's fair to say, but still technically and firmly a medieval writer. Yeah, so now that you've read Chaucer, I imagine you know that, or it became obvious to you, the English was a little funny there. So the Middle English that we're reading is coming from the Norton edition, at least in the protected reader. It's a very good edition. The words are glossed in a useful way, I think, but it's still difficult to read because we are moving back from us 600 years back, and English has changed a great deal. Still readable, however. There are texts written at the same time, things like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, that are written in other parts of England where they have a much more distinct dialect and regional inflection of English, and that would be very difficult for us to read. Chaucer, however, is writing in London. It's sort of the standard English at the time, and it becomes our own standard English. So it is possible to read, although it is difficult. But it is sort of a rite of passage for English students that in English courses we always require people to read Chaucer in Middle English. It's just a convention and difficult. And one of the rites of passage is that you usually go around the room and have people actually read Middle English out loud, which is always embarrassing. So we will not be doing that in our course, but yeah. Nuns' Priest Tale, which we read, it's an example of a beast fable. This is not from Chaucer, but this is another beast fable, a book that you can see. These are enormously popular in the medieval period, which is why we're reading them in this course. I wanted you to be aware of this tradition because it is talking about animals in a big way. So animals suddenly are appearing in literature and appearing a lot, and this is where they are. What's interesting about this is that these animals are sentient, they're feeling, they can hurt and feel emotions, but they also are surprisingly human-like. So we want to talk about that, and this is the reason I put Chaucer on the syllabus, both as an example of the way that animals are imagined in this period, but to raise the question of what this means to do to talk about animal in a human-like way, which, and I'll end the lecture today by drawing attention to the fact that's still very common. We call this, of course, anthropomorphism. It's probably not hard to see. Anthropo, human, morph, which means shape, basically coming out of Latin. So human shape. They take on human characteristics. The Dream of the Rood, incidentally, has an anthropomorphic depiction of a tree. The tree is taking on characteristics of human being, in this case, Jesus. So we're going to see this again and again, that animals, and you've seen this already in your own life, take on characteristics of human beings when stories are told about them often. We'll discuss why. More on the Canterbury Tales. Just to frame this so you kind of understand what's going on, the Canterbury Tales as we have it consists of 29 separate tales. There were supposed to be more than 100, but Chaucer never got around to writing the rest of them. And they're the story of religious pilgrims. And in this period of time, pilgrimages were enormously popular, especially among people that had money. And they're on their way to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury, England. So why the Canterbury Tales? They're the story of people traveling to Canterbury. And they're doing so because they're religious pilgrims. We did not read the the Nuns Priest prologue and the general prologue, but what happens there in Chaucer, just to frame it, is we have a description of the pilgrims. They're described by a narrator, and we hear about the nuns, priests in the general prologue as well. And then they also have their own little prologue, in which case it's not the narrator talking about all of them together, but the individual person talking about themselves, basically. We didn't read that. We jumped right into each of the tales that they told. So why is this the Canterbury Tales? Well, it's Canterbury because they're traveling to Canterbury, England, and Tales because these are the tales, the stories being told by each of the people on their way to Canterbury. And we just read one of those tales, and that's the Nuns Priest tale. And what's interesting about this from our perspective, it involves barnyard animals. And it's meant to be read allegorically, not literally, as it's for the most part not about animals at all, but instead human beings. So we saw this distinction between allegory and literal readings again and again, of course, with pastoral, where it's sometimes confusing because you think that you're reading pastoral in a simple way, what's sometimes called naive pastoral, meaning literally, that it really is involving the environment. But it sometimes isn't, often isn't. Instead, it's meant to be read allegorically, as a political or ecclesiastical allegory, being a critique of a monarch or whatever. Here we have the same issue, and which we have animals that you'd assume that we're actually literally talking about animals, but instead we are allegorically talking about human beings. This is an important point. It might be sort of a protracted example to read the Canterbury Tales when it in fact isn't literally about animals, but this is the genre of writing about animals that existed for hundreds and hundreds of years in the very beginning of English literature and before, and continues today. So it's this interesting way of thinking about what animals are by way of what human beings are. Put that another way, for hundreds of years, human beings dealt with animals in a human way, projected human characteristics onto them. It's very, very clear in this older text like this that that's what's being done. We'll end on a very modern example of how it works too. But it's interesting to think about that entire project and to sort of see it written large here, because that's how we still sometimes think of animals, by projecting human characteristics on them. In other words, the anthropomorphic project is alive and well today. But this case, very, very allegorical. So Chanticleer and Pertelote. Pertelote is his number one wife. They're described as azure, paramour, damoiselle, debonair. These are, in fact, French words. And what Chaucer is doing here is critiquing the British court. Why he's using French is, at this time, England is thought of kind of as the backwater of Europe. In fairness, it is. And as a consequence, England itself didn't have this sort of, feeling of its own cultural credibility to even use its own language in court. So the British court at this time is principally speaking French. This will happen later, and centuries later, in Russia as well, or the Russian court speaking French too. But Chaucer is critical of this. Chaucer is very much in favor of, an indigenous English language being the language of the people, and he wants to make fun of English aristocrats trying to act like they are French aristocrats. So he does this, and does it very, very wonderfully in a very pointed way, not by describing them directly, but by describing this very cocky rooster who's all, puffed up and all, and that's Chanticleer. Chanticleer is a critique of British aristocracy trying to be something they're not. It's great fun and very funny when you read it this way, of course. But in recent decades, literary critics have looked carefully at disenfranchised groups. Women are one of the first examples, but this has been done on registers of class, race, religious conviction, nationality, sexual preference, and so forth. And in doing that, we were very interested, of course, in how women are, for example, represented 300 years ago, 500 years ago in one culture and another culture. And it can tell us a great deal about how they were thought. And it is interesting, however, that in recent years, we've looked at a new disenfranchised group, and that is non-human beings, such as animals, and how they are represented. So it does raise a question of, what exactly do we think about animals when they are just being used as a stand-in for human beings? It's of course interesting to look at what we can learn through the depictions of animals. So in a very literal way, Varro's on agriculture told us a lot about the relationship between animals and human beings. I mean, Varro obviously acts very violently towards non-human beings because he feels that he has no obligation to them. Read in that way, they have no rights. They have nothing conferred on them, even resembling a right. If we were reading this, of course, in terms of gender, class, race, or something, we would be mortified as well to read that this was this group of entities, of human beings who were thought of as just things that could be acted upon and had no rights whatsoever. Here, however, it's a non-human entity that's the subject. So it does raise a question: what sort of posture toward non-human life, in this case birds, chickens, is contained in the Nun's Priest Tale? Certainly life on the widow's farm is more pleasant than Varro's, but the million-dollar question here, does speaking for animals and depicting them anthropomorphically do them any sort of service? In other words, what is it that we're getting out of doing this when we anthropomorphically talk about animals? Does it do them a service, or does it do them a disservice? So it's important to note that this is a very, very common practice. Aesop's fables These are written in the 6th century Greece, so we're moving back from Chaucer a couple thousand years. You probably know this story, has certain environmental import, I guess. The country mouse and the town mouse is an Aesop fable. They're of course enormously popular now in the Middle Ages in England. And it does raise the question of what exactly are we doing for these non-human entities. Do we learn anything, for example, about country mice? You know what I mean? The moral of that story is that from a human being, it's entirely a human point of view about the preference of country and the urban and that sort of thing. But does it really tell us anything about the life of the animal? It's an interesting thought that in doing so, in depicting an animal like a human being, it doesn't necessarily make us sympathetic with the animal, or I'm trying to think of a way of putting it, the animal qualities of the animal. And what I mean by that is we might, because we see human qualities there, be sympathetic with that animal. But on the other hand, when you read something like Chanticleer's story, the Nun's Priest Tale, it doesn't necessarily make you sympathetic with the plight of animals per se. I mentioned here Varro because Varro, even though it doesn't set out to do that, makes you far more sympathetic to the plight of animals because you realize how these, sentient beings, which Varro knew were sentient, are treated in the nuns in his, the way he imagines farmers should treat animals. It's surprising, though, then that a story all about animals trying to get into their lives, and that is what Chaucer is doing here, is depicting their lives. And again, I offer this up just as one example because there are literally thousands of examples, not only from England, but France, Germany, Italy, of beast tales that do this. They don't necessarily make you that sympathetic with the animal's life because you don't know too much about the life of the animal on the farm. Yes, it is there in Chaucer, and in fact I encourage people to look carefully about it. It'd be a good thing to write on if you were interested. In other words, how animal are Chaucer's animals, as opposed to how human are they. But it raises this larger question, which is we're dealing with for the first time really in this text, about what happens when we imagine animals. If we do so just as human beings, what service does that do to them? We try to imagine them in a non-human way. It's difficult often because the limit of our ability to understand something from a human perspective starts coming into play. Yeah. On the other hand, when you draw attention to the fact that a non-human entity is able to feel, and you talk about them feeling pain or loss and all, that can be highly effective because it is sort of like we just saw with the Dream of the Rood. It does a certain amount of doubling. There's this coincidental thing that where animals and humans overlap. We may debate the way our different intellectual powers work and what we can think about and how our memory works and all that sort of thing. But on a very basic level, that if you step on my foot, I'll yell, and if I step on my dog's foot, she'll yell. We have that certain similar things. We feel pain, we feel loss, and potentially a story about an animal can bring that about. But I do add, and it does raise larger environmental questions, that is not a common practice in this period, at least. It is going to start to change by the time we get to the Renaissance. I'll just hint at that now, where animal rights become an issue, where people begin to think that things like bear baiting are very bad things because it is just, to be blunt, cruelty to animals. They don't always reject something like bear baiting because it's cruelty to animals. Sometimes they're rejected for religious reasons. They don't like gambling and sports and that sort of thing. But increasingly people are going to think about the plight of animals and the way animals are. But this is interesting to look at Chaucer here because it's not just Chaucer. I suggested it goes back to the 6th century before the Christian era with Aesop and elsewhere. That's not typically how animals have been represented. There are exceptions, but Nuns' Priest Tale is a good example of how they typically were. So this is not Mickey Mouse, but Mickey Mouse's prototype, Steamboat Willie. Note that he acts like, dresses like, talks like in most ways, is more like a person than a mouse. He doesn't resemble a mouse much. He's meant to be a person. If you look at the way that animals are typically depicted today, and cartoons and graphic arts in general are a good example of it. This tradition, the beast tale, is still alive and well. Subsequent Disney movies, and then offshoots of that type of animation, even more modern versions by Pixar and all, they're all about this. They're all about the anthropomorphizing of animals, of making animals like human beings, of allegorically making animals into human beings. And this raises the question, what do we do when we make anthropomorphic depictions of animals? Do they make us more sympathetic to animals? Does Chanticleer and Pertolot make us more sympathetic to chickens and their plight in the world, or does Steamboat Willie or Mickey Mouse make us more sympathetic to animals, or any of the Disney depictions? Or does it cause us to cease to see them as animals at all, as rather instead human beings? So the question I wanted to introduce here with Chaucer, and he's as good an example as any, is what then do we make of animals? The tradition that we have, and it's coming out of the Middle Ages, is to see them as human-like, and that's a good thing, because you're less likely to want to kill them or to hurt them if they have certain human characteristics. But is this sort of another variation of that, human-centered project? So we saw Lynn White Jr. arguing that the difficulty with Christianity is that it is, and this is to quote him exactly, perhaps the most anthropocentric religion the world has ever known. Well, okay. Is then this both anthropocentric because it is highly anthropomorphic? Is the project of anthropomorphism, as it works with animals and even other non-human entities like trees, like the Rood, the oak tree, is that doing them a favor or not? And it's a fascinating question, and one that could be taken up by an entire course that could look at depictions of animals. But we will see it and return to it again and again, and I just wanted to introduce it here. And it also raises questions of allegory and literal, that when you speak about a feature of the environment or an animal allegorically, what is the relationship between that and the literal? But okay. So the course, the first half in some ways is over. Next time we're going to be entering the Renaissance, the early modern period, and some distinctly modern issues. Okay, but that will be it for today. Take care.